I began to notice that my wife often ran to the restroom every day because of nausea, and when she got a stomachache, I realized that something was wrong because I always managed to finish everything on time without consequences. Now I will tell you the whole story from the beginning. I never thought I'd find myself in this position. Discovering your wife's infidelity is the kind of nightmare that only happens to other people. You hear stories, sympathize with friends or distant relatives who go through it, but you never imagine that it could invade your own life. And yet, here I am, recounting the events that led me to this exact moment. My name is David, and my wife, Claire, was my college sweetheart. We met during my last year of undergrad and connected over shared passions, travel, music, and a shared dream of raising a big family someday. She was so full of life, always pushing me to be a better version of myself. I loved that about her. Or maybe I loved the idea of her, of who I thought she was. Life together was solid, or at least it felt that way. We'd been married 7 years, lived in a small town outside Seattle, and had built a modest but fulfilling life together. We both worked, me in software engineering, Claire in nonprofit administration, and we enjoyed a comfortable routine. Looking back, maybe I was too comfortable, too wrapped up in the day-to-day grind to notice the tiny shifts, the small signs that something wasn't right. It started with small changes. Claire was spending longer hours at work. At first, it made sense. She'd recently been promoted to lead a project for one of the organization's biggest donors. She had plenty of deadlines to meet, but as the weeks turned into months, her time away became a point of tension between us. I joked that her boss should pay us for the dinners she missed or the weekends she worked through. Claire would laugh it off, a strained chuckle that barely covered her exhaustion, or something more. But one evening, the familiar tension morphed into something darker. I remember the night clearly. It was a quiet Tuesday in late October. The rain was pounding on the roof as I sat on the couch, scrolling mindlessly on my phone. Claire had just come home, cheeks flushed from the cold and her hair damp. She dropped her purse on the counter with a heavy sigh and flashed a quick smile my way. "Long day?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though I felt the pang of frustration again. She'd been working late for weeks, and her excuses were wearing thin. "Yeah," she murmured, barely meeting my eyes before heading upstairs to shower. And that's when I saw it. Her phone, half hidden in her open purse. I wasn't a snooper by nature, but something pushed me that night, some instinct I hadn't felt before. My hand trembled slightly as I picked it up and pressed the power button. At first, nothing seemed off. Just a bunch of texts from friends and coworkers, the usual back and forth about upcoming events and work. But then, as I scrolled through the contacts, a name caught my eye, Derek. There were no messages in the thread, but the name alone sent an uneasy chill down my spine. Derek was her coworker, someone she'd mentioned offhand once or twice, usually when discussing her project. I shook it off, closing her phone and setting it back. I was overthinking. Derek was a common enough name, and maybe I'd misread the situation. But the doubts had started, gnawing at the edges of my mind, and they weren't about to let go. For the next few weeks, I noticed little things, strange texts at odd hours, her lingering on calls in another room, a sudden reluctance to share details about her day. I kept silent, not wanting to jump to conclusions. But something had shifted in her, or maybe in us. Then came the night that broke everything open. It was mid-November. Claire had been out again, this time at a supposed work dinner. When she finally came home, I was sitting at the kitchen table, just staring at the clock. She dropped her coat onto the chair and froze when she saw me. "Hey," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hey," I replied, trying to keep the edge out of my tone. But my patience was thinning, my tolerance for excuses barely holding up. She shifted uncomfortably. "Sorry I'm late again." The dinner ran longer than expected. I studied her face. Something about her expression, the way her gaze flickered as she avoided my eyes, told me everything I needed to know. "Was it really just work, Claire?" I asked, each word measured, calm. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She was silent for a long moment before shaking her head, almost as if trying to clear her thoughts. "David, of course it was just work. What else would it be?" She let out a soft laugh, but it didn't reach her eyes. And that's when I felt the crack. "Claire, I know about Derek," I said. watching her reaction carefully, her face drained of color, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. "Derek?" she repeated, her voice a little too high-pitched, a little too panicked. I nodded, keeping my gaze steady. "I've noticed how often you're with him, how many late nights you've had because of him." For a split second, something flashed in her eyes, a mix of shock and something else I couldn't quite place. Then she straightened her back, exhaling sharply. "David, this is ridiculous. Derek is just a coworker. That's it." The conversation spiraled into a series of denials and accusations, each more strained than the last. I tried to be calm, rational, but the doubts kept swirling, pushing me towards something I didn't want to admit. By the end of it, she'd stormed upstairs, slamming the bedroom door behind her. The following days were tense. We barely spoke, both of us clinging to our routines, avoiding each other like we were strangers sharing a house instead of a married couple. But my mind was set on finding the truth, no matter how painful it might be. I decided to hire a private investigator. It felt extreme, even underhanded, but I needed to know the truth. I couldn't live in this fog, unsure if I was being paranoid or if my marriage was crumbling beneath me. A week later, the PI sent me the photos, each one a dagger twisting deeper into my heart. Pictures of Claire and Derek meeting up at cafes, stolen kisses in dark corners, her staying at his apartment overnight. The evidence was undeniable. My first instinct was to confront her, to demand answers, to scream out all the anger that had been building inside me. But then, something stopped me. I realized that this wasn't just about her betrayal. It was about what lay ahead. If this affair was out in the open, it would destroy everything we had built, every connection to family and friends, everything we had worked so hard to achieve. So, I kept my silence, carefully planning my next steps. If Claire was willing to throw away our marriage for another man, I was going to find out why. And more importantly, I would uncover whatever else she was hiding. Because if she had the nerve to deceive me like this, I had a feeling her lies went far deeper than I'd first suspected. The days that followed were a surreal blur. I felt like an actor, living a double life. By day, I went through the motions at work, smiled at neighbors, made small talk with coworkers. By night, I was a man haunted, replaying every moment I'd ever shared with Claire and scrutinizing each one for clues I might have missed. But the most excruciating part was pretending around Claire. Each evening, I'd return home, bracing myself as I walked through the door, unsure of what version of my wife I'd encounter. Some nights, she'd be her usual, warm self, asking about my day or making dinner. On others, she'd come home late, mumbling about deadlines or dodging questions. The warmth between us had chilled to a polite tolerance. She probably thought I'd swallowed her excuses, and maybe she even felt a bit of relief that I hadn't brought up Derek since that argument. In the quiet moments, a nagging thought began to take root. If she was hiding her affair so carefully, what else was she concealing? A part of me hated the paranoia growing inside me, but another part was determined to follow it, even if it led to answers I didn't want to hear. The clue came from an unlikely source, a dinner with Claire's best friend, Amelia. She and Claire had been close since high school, practically sisters. Amelia didn't know about my suspicions, but that evening she unwittingly tipped her hand. We were sitting around the table, a cozy little restaurant downtown, with Amelia filling me in on the gossip and happenings in their circle of friends. Claire, already tense, shifted nervously beside me as Amelia chattered on. "So, Claire, are you feeling better?" Amelia asked offhandedly, looking concerned. "You know, after last week?" Claire shot her a sharp look, and Amelia froze, her face going pale as she glanced between us. My heart rate spiked. What had happened last week? "Last week?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light, though I could feel Claire's warning gaze drilling into Amelia. "Oh, it's nothing really." Claire's laugh was hollow, forced. "I just wasn't feeling well, that's all." I nodded, but something about the exchange unsettled me. Claire's reaction had been too quick, too defensive, and Amelia's flustered response hinted at something more significant than a routine illness. I filed it away, waiting until later that night to press her on it. After we'd driven Amelia home and Claire was asleep, I sat in bed, staring at the ceiling. The gears in my mind turned as I tried to connect the pieces. I'd learned from the PI that she was still seeing Derek, but what if there was another layer to her secrecy? The next day, I did something I never thought I'd do. I went through Claire's things, something I'd avoided in the past out of respect. But all bets were off now. As I combed through her drawers, shelves, and bedside table, I found nothing unusual at first. Just the usual clutter. Old receipts, half-empty lotion bottles, stray paper clips, a lipstick or two. But then, tucked inside a folder in her desk, I found a small envelope with a doctor's office letterhead. My pulse quickened as I opened it. It was a medical bill, dated 3 weeks prior. At the top, in crisp, black letters, was the name of a clinic I didn't recognize. And below, it listed the service rendered, ultrasound consultation. I stared at the paper, trying to process what this meant. An ultrasound? Claire hadn't mentioned anything about going to a clinic. My mind raced through the possibilities, each one more troubling than the last. Was she sick? Was something wrong with her? But another, darker thought wormed its way in. What if the ultrasound had nothing to do with illness? The world seemed to tilt as the implications sank in. I sat there, staring at that single word on the paper, barely breathing. Could it be possible? Was Claire pregnant? The timing of it all, her secrecy, her affair with Derek, it all clicked into place with a sickening certainty. If she'd gone for an ultrasound, and she was hiding it from me, then it was likely the child wasn't mine. I was numb. Even in my worst nightmares, I hadn't anticipated this twist. The betrayal itself was one thing, but to carry another man's child, to keep it hidden from me, it felt like a violation that went beyond anything I could fathom. In the days that followed, I watched Claire with a new perspective, every glance, every word loaded with meaning. She was carrying a secret, and it wasn't just Derek. She was pregnant, and I was almost certain the child wasn't mine. The worst part was her attempt to mask it. I watched her play the role of a dutiful wife, carefully sidestepping any mention of doctors or ultrasounds, never showing the slightest sign that anything was amiss. Her ability to pretend, to lie with such ease, made me question if I had ever really known her. I'd gone from anger to confusion to a cold, calculating detachment. I knew what I had to do next. If Claire wanted to keep her secrets, then I would be the one to uncover them. Every last one. Over the next week, I hired the PI again, this time asking him to dig into her recent medical records. I didn't know if he'd be able to access them, but he assured me he had his methods. While I waited for his findings, I prepared myself mentally, rehearsing what I might say to her when the truth finally came out. A few days later, I received the call. I stepped out of a meeting at work to answer, my heart pounding. The PI's voice was calm, almost clinical as he relayed the news. "Yes, David, your wife is indeed pregnant," he said. "The ultrasound confirmed it. She's about 8 weeks along." I clenched the phone, my knuckles white. 8 weeks. The timing was a match. It aligned perfectly with the time she'd been seeing Derek. "And one more thing," the PI continued, his voice lowering slightly. "She's scheduled a follow-up appointment next week. I don't know if it's related, but it's at the same clinic." I thanked him, hung up, and sat in the silence of my office. 8 weeks. Derek's child. The reality of it settled over me like a heavy, suffocating weight. But it wasn't just the pregnancy itself that shook me. It was the fact that she had planned to hide it from me, to carry on this deception indefinitely. I couldn't imagine what her plan was. Was she going to pretend it was mine, convince me to raise another man's child? Or was she planning to leave me altogether? One thing was certain. This was bigger than a simple affair. It was a betrayal that cut to the core of everything we had built together, a violation of the trust and love I thought we shared. And now, it was time for her to face the truth. The night before her follow-up appointment, I laid my cards on the table. We were sitting at the dinner table, the air thick with unspoken words. I cleared my throat, my voice calm, almost eerily so. "Claire, are you happy?" I asked, watching her carefully. She looked up, her eyes widening slightly in surprise. "Of course, David," she replied, a nervous laugh escaping her lips. "Why would you ask that?" "Because you're hiding something from me." I held her gaze, and I saw a flicker of panic in her eyes. "I'm not," she began, but I cut her off. Don't, I said quietly, my voice edged with steel. I know. About Derek. About the pregnancy. I know everything. Her face went ashen, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to respond. For the first time, I saw genuine fear in her eyes, a look of someone who had been caught in a carefully spun web of lies. David, she started, her voice barely a whisper. It's not what you think. It's exactly what I think, I replied, the calm in my voice belying the turmoil within. You've been lying to me, planning to keep this from me. Were you going to pretend it was mine? Or were you planning to disappear, to start a new life with him? Tears filled her eyes, and she shook her head, her hands trembling. But I didn't flinch. I couldn't afford to. Not after everything I'd uncovered. You had a choice, Claire, I said, my voice cold and steady. You chose him. Now, you'll have to live with that choice. I stood, leaving her at the table, her sobs echoing through the empty house as I walked away. For the first time, I felt a strange sense of peace, a calmness in knowing the truth. But I also knew this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning of the fallout, the moment before everything we had came crashing down. The days following our confrontation were quiet, almost hauntingly so. Claire and I barely spoke, each of us caught in the undertow of our broken marriage. She tried to reach out at times, but I shut her down, keeping my distance, unwilling to let her explanations or apologies muddy the waters. It was too late for that. At work, I threw myself into projects, pushing through endless meetings and deadlines just to keep my mind off everything. But no matter how much I tried to escape it, the reality of her betrayal hung over me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of her with him, and the imagined scenes played over and over like a loop I couldn't turn off. One afternoon, about a week after our confrontation, Claire approached me in the living room. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, her face drawn and pale. She held a cup of tea, her hands trembling slightly as she set it down on the coffee table. David, she began, her voice barely audible. Can we talk? Please. I glanced at her, feeling an ache in my chest that was as familiar as it was painful. Part of me wanted to walk out, to avoid hearing whatever weak excuses or regrets she had prepared. But another part of me, the part that had loved her, trusted her, wanted to know why, wanted to understand how we'd gone from everything to nothing. After a long silence, I nodded. Fine. Talk. She sat across from me, her gaze fixed on the carpet, avoiding my eyes. For a moment, neither of us spoke, and the silence between us felt like a vast canyon, impossible to bridge. I know I've hurt you, she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't plan for this to happen. I didn't want things to turn out this way. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay calm. You didn't plan for this? You didn't want things to turn out this way? I repeated, my voice hard. Claire, you've been lying to me for months. You're carrying his child and trying to hide it from me. You chose to lie. Don't tell me you didn't plan for this. She winced, visibly shaken by my words. I know, she whispered, tears filling her eyes. I know, and I'm so sorry, David. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even know if I'll ever forgive myself. I didn't answer, watching her as she buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. She sat there for what felt like an eternity, sobbing quietly as the weight of her decisions finally hit her. After a long moment, she looked up, wiping her face. I never meant to hurt you, she said softly, her voice choked. I never wanted to lose you. I shook my head, feeling a strange mixture of anger and pity. If you didn't want to lose me, why didn't you stop? Why didn't you come to me when you started having doubts? She looked away, her lips trembling. I don't know. I was confused. I felt trapped, like I was losing myself, like I needed something else to feel alive. Her words cut through me, twisting the knife even deeper. So I wasn't enough for her. Our life, our plans, our marriage, they weren't enough to make her feel alive. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the sting of her words. Then why did you hide it from me? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Why didn't you just leave? She looked down, shame written across her face. I was scared, David. Scared of losing everything. I know it doesn't make sense, but part of me wanted both. I wanted to be with you, to keep our life together. But I also wanted something new. Something that wasn't tied to everything I'd known. I sat back, exhaling slowly. The weight of her confession settled heavily over me. She wanted both lives, two separate worlds, each without the burden of the other. But in her desperate attempt to have it all, she destroyed everything in the process. So what now, Claire? I asked, my voice hard. What do you expect me to do? Do you think we can go back to the way things were? She shook her head, her eyes welling with tears again. No, I know we can't go back. I just wanted you to know how sorry I am. For everything. I wanted to laugh, to tell her how empty her apology felt after everything she'd done. But I held back, swallowing the bitterness that clawed its way up my throat. Sorry doesn't change anything, I said, my voice cold. You made your choice, and now you'll have to live with it. With that, I stood up and left her sitting there, the sounds of her quiet sobs trailing after me as I walked away. For a few days, life continued in this eerie state of half-existence. Claire and I barely spoke. We moved around each other like strangers, sharing the same house but nothing else. I knew it was only a matter of time before one of us made the first real move, the first concrete step toward ending this sham of a marriage. Then, one evening, as I was preparing to head out to clear my head, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. Normally, I would have ignored it, but something compelled me to answer. David? A hesitant male voice asked. Yes. Who is this? The voice cleared its throat. It's Derek. I think we need to talk. I froze, gripping the phone tightly. Derek, the man who'd turned my wife's life, and mine, upside down. Every instinct screamed at me to hang up, but I forced myself to stay calm. What do you want, Derek? I asked, my voice barely concealing my contempt. He hesitated, as though gathering his thoughts. Look, I know you don't want to hear from me. I wouldn't want to hear from me either if I were in your position. But I think it's only fair that you know the truth. All of it. I clenched my jaw, feeling a surge of anger. The truth? The truth is that you had an affair with my wife and got her pregnant. What more do I need to know? There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then a sigh. Look, I know this is complicated, but it's more than that. It's not as simple as you think. My anger gave way to confusion. What do you mean? He took a shaky breath. Claire never told you the full story, did she? No, I said, my voice cold. She only told me the parts she wanted me to know. The parts that don't make her look even worse. Another pause. Listen, Derek continued, his tone apologetic. I know you don't owe me anything, but could we meet? Just for a few minutes. I promise you, this isn't just about the affair. There's something you need to know. I hesitated, torn between anger and curiosity. This was the man who destroyed my marriage, who'd taken everything from me. But his voice held a desperation that I couldn't ignore. And a part of me needed answers, needed to understand how everything had unraveled so completely. Fine, I said finally. Tomorrow. There's a coffee shop on Cedar Street. Be there at noon. The next day, I arrived at the coffee shop a few minutes early, my mind spinning with thoughts of what he might say. When Derek finally walked in, I almost didn't recognize him. He looked worse for wear, with dark circles under his eyes and a slumped posture that made him look older than he was. He spotted me and approached, his gaze avoiding mine as he took a seat across from me. Thanks for coming, he mumbled, staring down at his hands. Get to the point, I said, not bothering to mask the disdain in my voice. He nodded, taking a deep breath. David, I know this sounds unbelievable, but this wasn't just some careless affair. I mean, it wasn't just a fling. Claire and we didn't start this out of lust or some impulsive attraction. It's more complicated than that. I felt my fists clench under the table. Complicated? You and my wife lied to me for months. You got her pregnant, and she tried to pass it off as mine. How is that anything other than betrayal? Derek looked away, guilt flickering across his face. I know, and I'm not here to make excuses. I'm here because, well, there's something I think you should know. Claire and I, we were seeing each other years before you and she even met. The words hit me like a physical blow. I blinked, stunned, trying to process what he just said. You were together before? I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. Derek nodded, his gaze fixed on the table. We were together in college. Claire was my first love, and I was hers. We were inseparable, but things fell apart after graduation. We both went in different directions, and eventually, she met you. I stared at him, numb with shock. This revelation changed everything. The betrayal felt deeper, more complex, woven into the fabric of our entire relationship. Why would she go back to you now? I asked, my voice raw. After all these years, what did she see in you that she couldn't find in our marriage? He looked up, his eyes haunted. I don't know, David. Maybe it was nostalgia. Maybe it was a need to reconnect with her past. But it wasn't right, and we both knew it. For the first time, I saw real regret in his eyes. But it didn't change the fact that he and Claire had destroyed my life. I rose from my seat, feeling a cold sense of finality settle over me. I don't care what your reasons were, Derek, I said, my voice steady. The two of you took everything I believed in and tore it apart. And now, you'll have to live with that. I left him sitting there, my footsteps echoing as I walked away from the man who had unknowingly become the architect of my pain. But there was one thing I knew with absolute certainty now. This was the end. Claire's past, her betrayal, her lies. All of it was irreparably shattered. As I walked out into the cold, gray afternoon, I felt a strange sense of clarity, a release from the prison of questions and doubt. There was nothing left to salvage, nothing left to fix. It was time to let go. When I left Derek sitting there in that coffee shop, a weight lifted off my shoulders. There was something liberating about hearing the whole truth, no matter how devastating. I had my answers, the pieces of the past Claire had hidden from me, woven with threads of deceit and desperation. Now, there was only one thing left to do. Confront her one last time and finally close this chapter of my life. I went home that evening, walking through the door with a newfound sense of resolve. Claire was sitting on the living room couch, staring absently at the muted television. When she heard me enter, she looked up, her face lined with exhaustion and regret. She'd been waiting for this conversation. I took a deep breath and sat across from her, meeting her gaze without a trace of emotion. I saw Derek today, I said calmly. Her eyes widened slightly, but she didn't speak. She only lowered her head, bracing herself for whatever I was about to say. You've been lying to me for years, haven't you, Claire? I asked quietly, feeling the calm anger simmering beneath the surface. This wasn't just a moment of weakness. This was a carefully kept secret, buried deep, and one you never intended to share with me. She looked up, her eyes brimming with tears. David, I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice trembling. I know I've hurt you. I know I've destroyed everything, and I can't make it right. But please understand that it wasn't planned. I didn't go back to Derek with the intention of betraying you. Then why, Claire? I demanded, my voice rising. Why would you go back to someone you'd left behind, someone you swore was part of your past? And why drag me through the lie, making me believe I was enough for you when I clearly never was? Her tears spilled over, and she reached out as if to touch me, but I drew back, folding my arms. The hurt in her eyes was obvious, but it did nothing to soften the bitterness that had built up inside me. I don't know, David, she said finally, her voice breaking. Maybe it was selfishness. Maybe I wanted to escape my own life, the life we built together, and I thought I could keep both worlds, keep both of you. I let out a hollow laugh, shaking my head. And did you think I'd just raise another man's child? That I'd take your betrayal and simply accept it? Her face crumpled, and she buried her face in her hands. I didn't know what to do, she whispered. I was scared. I was so scared of losing you, of losing everything we'd built. I thought I could somehow make it work. I thought maybe I could. I could convince you that the child was mine? I finished for her, my voice flat. You thought I'd just accept the lie, that I'd never find out? She nodded, and for a moment, the room was filled with the sound of her quiet sobs echoing against the walls. I watched her, feeling the last remnants of sympathy drain from me. Whatever love we'd once shared had died the moment she chose to betray me. There was nothing left to salvage, no part of her words that could undo the damage. "I'm leaving, Claire," I said finally, my voice steady. "I can't stay here and pretend to rebuild something that's been broken beyond repair." She looked up, panic flashing across her face. "David, please, we can try. We can go to counseling. Or maybe just take some time to figure things out." "No," I said firmly. "I've made up my mind. I've spent months wondering if I was going crazy, questioning everything about myself, about us. But now I know. You and I, we don't belong in each other's lives anymore." Her face fell, and I could see the finality of it settling over her, the reality that this was truly the end. She nodded, her hands trembling as she clutched a tissue, her voice barely a whisper. "I understand," she said, wiping her tears. I just want you to know that I never stopped loving you. Even if I ruined everything, even if I failed you, I never stopped loving you." I looked at her, feeling a faint, hollow ache in my chest. But love wasn't enough to erase what she'd done. It wasn't enough to heal the scars she'd left behind. "Goodbye, Claire," I said quietly, standing up and heading toward the stairs to pack my things. The next few days passed in a blur. I moved out that weekend, leaving behind the house that had been filled with so many memories, both good and bad. I took only what was mine, leaving her with the empty shell of a home that had once been our sanctuary. In the weeks that followed, I adjusted to my new life. I rented a small apartment in the city, a modest place with just enough space for me. I filled my days with work, long hours at the office, dinners alone at quiet restaurants, weekends spent with friends who'd rallied around me. They didn't ask for details, and I was grateful for their silent support. One evening, a few weeks after I'd left, I received an unexpected letter from Claire. It was a simple envelope with her familiar handwriting, addressed to my new apartment. Against my better judgment, I opened it, scanning the words scrawled across the page. "David, I don't expect you to forgive me, and I don't expect you to want me back. But I want you to know that I am truly, deeply sorry. I've spent countless nights lying awake, haunted by the pain I've caused, by the hurt I've inflicted on you. I know I have no right to ask for anything, but if I could ask for one thing, it would be your forgiveness. Not for my sake, but for yours. I want you to be free, David. Free from the anger, free from the betrayal, free from the memories of us that I've tainted. I hope that one day you'll find peace, that you'll find someone who loves you the way you deserve to be loved. I wish you a life filled with happiness, with the love and honesty that I could never give you. Thank you for everything you gave me. I will always love you, even if I lost the right to be loved in return. Claire." I sat there, staring at the letter, feeling a strange mixture of sadness and closure. There was no satisfaction, no triumph in her words, only a quiet acceptance that this chapter was over. And as I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, I felt a weight lifting, a burden easing from my shoulders. Claire was my past, a painful but necessary part of my journey. And now, for the first time in months, I felt the stirrings of hope, a glimmer of something new on the horizon. The pain would linger, the scars would remain, but I knew that I would heal. I would move forward, unburdened by the betrayal that had once defined me. And as I looked out the window, watching the city lights flicker in the evening haze, I let out a long, steady breath. It was over, and I was finally free.